morning, everybody. And I know we have some people who are new to Represent and new to our breakfast briefings, and some people who've been with us before. Before we get started, I want to let you know the purpose of these breakfast briefings and the series we've been having is to familiarize both our current donors and investors in issues that they might be interested in learning more about, but it's also connecting the dots for everybody, connecting the dots between the issues you care about and possible changes in legislation. We at Represent believe that so many of these issues will best be fixed, can best be attacked by having a Democratic leadership in both the House and the Senate. And I think that at the end of today's call, you should have that feeling. I'm hoping you all have that feeling also with regard to education. While we're going on, we've got some other, and at the end we'll talk about our upcoming breakfast briefings. But if there's subjects that you think we should be addressing, put them in the chat room so we'll know what's going on. And if you have other ideas, if there are certain things that we've talked about that really hit you and you said this message needs to be put into all of your communication, be sure to put that in the chat also, because we're looking for ways for you, when you get off this call, to be able to go to your friends and say, I just learned a lot, and here's why you should be involved and Represent. And by the way, all of our events, we do film them and video them, and we are putting the videos on our website as past events, so that you can, if you've learned something and you want to share it with somebody you know, feel free to do so and send them to our website, because we hope that it makes them feel more involved. So we're just going to show you who our speakers are today. We're thrilled to have Donna Cooper as our key speaker today, because she's been leading an effort to talk about funding of K-12 schools as the executive director of PCCY. And really, she's the one who we felt had the broadest understanding of why we fund schools the way we do and what changes we should make. Senator Lindsey Williams is in her first term as a senator. Represent was proud to support her in her election 2 years ago. She is on the Education Committee for the Senate, and she'll talk a bit about what kinds of things they talk about in the Education Committee and why it will make a difference when she's in the majority. And then we also have two of our candidates on. Michele Knoll is an educator and school board director and has been a family therapist, and she's in Allegheny County. Emily Skopoff is also located in Allegheny County. Now, for those of you in Southeast PA, you may be wondering why the three incumbent/candidates we have are all from Allegheny County. And that's because Represent takes a full state look at this. Most, or an awful lot of our donors are in Southeast Pennsylvania. But unless we take a full state look at who the people are and who's representing all of Pennsylvania, we can't achieve the needs that we have for the state government. One of the things Represent does is we do keep track of ways that we consider that our state government, and in particular our legislature, is failing us. There are some things the governor would like to do, but he can't do without without the legislative approval, and the Republicans haven't grasp or firm grip on what's going on in terms of funding and priorities in this state. So we track a whole lot of issues, and these are some of our favorites that all have to deal with education. And some of you have probably heard me say these before, but I want to make sure they're drilled into your head the way they are mine. PA school funding for K-12 is the most uneven in the country between rich and poor school districts, because, and Donna will talk about this. We also, our college graduates graduate from college in Pennsylvania with the highest amount of debt of any state in the country. On overall rankings, Pennsylvania ranks 30th in the United States in the quality of our public education. Our pre-K spending is far below the states that are all around Pennsylvania. New York, New Jersey, Maryland, and Delaware all spend up to 4 times what we do on pre-K education. And Pennsylvania also has the worst community college system in the country when looked at in terms of in-state tuition and graduation rates. And most of these things are things that you don't know, you don't notice. My kids went to a very good public school system. I wasn't aware, of the major discrepancies. But they're things that we have so many people in our state who volunteer for efforts and do so many things for schools. But if we changed how we fund, a lot of the major issues could be addressed. Represent's main goal we see all these issues and we try and tie them to who's representing us. Our goal is to flip the Pennsylvania House and the Senate blue in 2020, enabling positive legislation. And that's 9 House seats and 4 Senate seats. It is well within our grasp to do. And guess what? We can almost do it just with women. I know we can do the House one with just women, but we also want to elect progressive women to have fairer representation. Right now, between the House and the Senate, women are made up of 26% women, 26.9. Our national rank in terms of percentage women is 32 out of the 50 states, the lowest among the northeastern states. How do we want to achieve our reflective democracy and make sure that our elected officials look like all of us in whatever measure you want? We want to flip our seats to D seats with women. We want to hold on to the D seats and protect our women incumbents, and we want to put more women into D seats. We want to make this change that's necessary in Pennsylvania, and our piece of reflective democracy is supporting women who demand change. How do we accomplish these goals? Well, we look at all of the Democratic women running for both House and Senate, and we ask them tedious, long questions about their progressive values. We also look at the flippability of seats to make sure that it's, we've had cases where we go, oh, what a nice woman. Gosh, she'd be a real asset. But the district's 95% Republican, and there might be better uses for our money. It's kind of like investing in your retirement funds. You may like a company, but would you invest your money there? And so what we do is we raise money and we invest it in good winnable races. We don't go out, we don't recruit candidates, we don't determine which candidates are running, but we make sure that the good progressive women who are running in winnable races have the money to do it. Cut the slides and we'll go to Donna Cooper. And Donna's going to tell us all about education in Pennsylvania, why we're and where we are, and how we're going to make changes. Donna.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me this morning. And we have a very short period of time, so I want to try and give you the high-level differences when we elect progressive candidates to the legislature versus the status quo that we have right now. I don't need to remind anybody here that we have a Republican majority in both the House and the Senate, and we are still recovering from the time period in which we also had a Republican governor who imposed a $1 billion cut on the K-12 system. Fortunately, Governor Wolf has restored almost to the penny that $1 billion cut. But in that period, which has now been 9 years, the cost of education have increased. As you heard at the top of the slides, we have the most inequitable school funding system in the country. The gap between the richest and the poor districts is the most pronounced here, the next state being Illinois. Both Illinois and Pennsylvania share an over-reliance on property taxes. So when you look at Pennsylvania's data, on average, we look like all the other states. On average, we are spending in the middle of the pack for educating our students between local property taxes and state funding. The difference being that communities where the property value is not robust, they can't generate enough money for their schools. And so in a majority of states, state funding compensates for the disparity in local property wealth so that poorer school districts, even though they are the highest taxed, and they are the highest taxed in Pennsylvania as well, in terms of percentage of income, the state compensates with state dollars. And what that's called in Pennsylvania is the basic education funding system. And so that puts about 6.3 billion of about 18 billion out there for our schools. But you heard me say 6.3 billion of about 18 billion. So the state funding is a very small minority. It's about 36% of the funding for our K-12 system. And we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we want federal spending for education in Pennsylvania. So what happens is states have a constitutional obligation, not the feds, to make sure that they are offering a quality education for our students. And we right now are in the midst of state litigation against the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, against the House and the Senate and the governor, to force equity in funding of education. There have been these lawsuits in 43 states. In about half of those states, the courts have found for the plaintiffs. In our case, it is 7 school districts and 6 families. And they are demanding that the state come to the table and put $2.3 billion on the table to compensate for the disparity across these districts. So I mentioned that the way we fund schools is basically through the basic education funding system. And what I want you to understand is when we had a Democratic governor named Ed Rendell, for whom I worked, I was the Secretary of Policy, we imposed a school funding formula. And that drove money out in accordance with poverty and in accordance with the actual number of students attending that school and in accordance with how many kids were not speaking English as their first language. Tom Corbett comes in, black lines the entire school funding formula, cuts $1 billion, and in the 4 years of the Corbett administration, made private one-off deals with Republican leaders in the House and the Senate to give certain school districts a little bit of money so that they could run for re-election without suffering the impact of the $1 billion cut. That's what happened when Tom Corbett was governor, right? Tom Wolf comes in. He still has a Republican majority, but in spite of that, one of the benefits of the Corbett cut is it united the 500 school districts in the state to say, wait a minute, this is crazy. We just lost $1 billion and there's one-off deals. There's too much backroom politics. And so Tom Wolf, together with the Democrats in the House and the Senate, and I have to say some good Republicans in the House and Senate, created a new school funding formula. And that school funding formula is one of the best in the country. It drives money out to very poor school districts with a density of poverty, and it also drives money out to school districts that have high numbers of English language learners. In addition, it recognizes that poor rural school districts actually are almost more expensive to operate than large urbans. So it drives extra money out for sparsity. So it's a really good school funding formula, and it even compensates for rising charter enrollment by giving school districts back some of the stranded costs that they bear because of charter expansion. So it's good, but less than 10% of our state money is going through the school funding formula. So 6.3 billion, and we're, about 700 million going through, I'd say a little bit more than 10% going through the formula. Where's the rest of the money going? So most of our state money is going out based on the number of students that we were educating in Pennsylvania in 1991. Now, again, for the benefit of Represent, what happened in 1991? Bob Casey was governor. We had a Democratic House. We had a Democratic Senate. Bob Casey said, we have to remedy this school. We're short of money. At that point, the state was funding half of education costs, which is where most states are, by the way, half. As I said earlier, we're at 36%, ranking Pennsylvania 48th from the bottom in terms of state share of education. So Bob Casey was trying to make sure we could stay up with that 50%, and it was expensive. And he went to the voters with a referenda to change how we do taxation in Pennsylvania so that there was less of a burden on property taxes, and that failed. And when that failed, the Democrats and the Republicans got spooked about funding education, and they could not come up with the money, and they agreed to freeze the student count and just give out new money, again, a little bit back office until Rendell came in, and we, again, put a formula in place that only affected new money. And so what you need to know is that there are 313 districts in this state that have lost 167,000 students since 1991. But we are still paying for every one of those school students as if they were there. We are paying $373 million for students that don't exist in the school districts that have lost 167,000 students since 1991. Those school districts collectively educate a third of the kids in the state. The school districts that educate 2/3 of the districts in the state, we don't have the will to generate the revenues to compensate them appropriately. So in fact, for the declining school districts, and Senator Wagner's in one of those, and your two candidates are actually, that you showcased here today, are from Western PA, we kind of have a little bit of an ideological civil war in education in Pennsylvania right now. It is both partisan, Democrat and Republican, and a little bit east and west, because the western part of the state has had declining student enrollment. And yet they have not only received the same amount of state money, they've received additional state money. We do not begrudge that. They need that money. We also need to fund the school districts that have not lost students. that are growing and that have increasingly high poverty students. And that's what the school funding formula was intended to do. We just don't have the will to put the money through it. And so we have a very different reality for the Western PA folks who are running for office than the Eastern PA folks who are running for office. Comparatively, property tax rates are lower in the West. Comparatively, school spending in general, there are anomalies here. And so candidates running in the West need to speak to things about driving down the impact of mandated state costs like rising pension obligations, rising charter enrollment, rising special ed costs. They are affecting those school districts dramatically, just like they're affecting the school districts in the center and the eastern part of the state, where those drivers are escalating, but at the same time, those school districts are not being paid for every student that is there. It's a double whammy on the east. In general, the other thing that we have as a problem in Pennsylvania, and it's not unique to us, but it's very pronounced, is that we underfund special education. It affects Eastern and Western school districts the same, although the Eastern school districts in the center bear that burden more heavily. So the state puts about $1.1 billion into special ed. We're about $7 billion under where we need totally between federal and state money. So our school districts are ending up they have to meet the needs of special ed students. So the regular basic ed money intended for traditional students will often have to be directed to meet the extraordinary needs of children who are special ed. And so we also have a little bit of a academic war going on between parents who have special ed kids and other parents who see dramatic differences and dramatic shortages of what they need. Rising class size for traditional education students and unmet needs for special ed students. And so we have lots of conflict within school districts about how resources are used. And most recently, school districts have begun to look at equity audits. Are we spending our money equitably within our school districts? Are we putting money in the poorest elementary schools as much as we're putting it into the wealthiest elementary schools or the middle schools? Is our money tracking to the students who come to school with the greatest educational needs? And those equity audits are beginning to raise a lot of questions, not only about how money is used inside, but even in the wealthiest school districts, what we find is that the buildings that have 30% or more kids in poverty, which basically is, an increasing share of every school in the state, they need more money in those buildings, and they don't have the liquidity because of relatively flat state aid. As I said, Tom Wolf increased the billion, restored the billion, but we haven't made any real progress since 2011, in spite of the fact that we've had enormous new cost. And so you have these internecine challenges that are then compounded by charter expansion. And so today you'll see a report coming out about charters being paid special ed funding for kids they're not educating, much like the money I talked about earlier, where there's 167,000 kids missing in these Western PA, primarily Western school districts. We have thousands of children who are being reimbursements being made to charter schools as if they were educating very intense needs students who are special ed, but those kids aren't there. And so we have this other internecine war between parents who are in charter schools and parents who are in traditional schools. And all of this conflict is a result of Pennsylvania's underfunding of public education, whether it's through the basic education funding formula or special ed. Now, one last thing I want to mention is that a lot of Republican lawmakers have really zeroed in on VOTEC as an area where they believe, and they are right, there's a lot of public interest and a lot of student interest. College debt contributes to that. We have students who go to private colleges, Penn State, Pitt, and Temple, all of which are extraordinarily expensive, contributing to the reason that Pennsylvania has such a high debt student load. So VOTEC is increasingly an option. Now, one of the reasons that the Republicans also look to this is it's pennies on the dollar, right? The VOTEC system is less than a $700 million line item in the budget. So increasing that by 10% is $70 million. You get a big win, you get a big press conference, right? But if we were funding the schools, with the $2.3 billion that's necessary, school districts could afford to pay the tuition and the cost for their kids to go to the regional VOTEX or their high school VOTEX. The reason we have a special line item where you can do a big press conference and say you're for VOTEC is it's a way to get around the fact that we aren't funding public education. And then the last part of this is that we have a private school tuition system in Pennsylvania called the Education Improvement Tax Credit. And as soon to be Representative Spokoff knows, Mike Terzai was the champion of increasing the Education Improvement Tax Credit so that he could drive money to religious education and private schools with absolutely no accountability. There's no tracking on whether the kids coming are poor, worthy of those scholarships, no tracking on whether they are retained in these schools, and no tracking on the performance of these kids. And every effort to try and bring accountability to these dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, were rebuffed by Representative Mike Terzai. There are, however, Republicans who we have common cause with. And I hope that the Represent candidates win and quickly reach out to build a bipartisan consensus, because there is no way that we will get $2.3 billion in new revenues for schools without some Republicans being part of a vote. Because the nuts and bolts of a tax vote, which is basically what we need, cannot be simply a party line vote. That makes, it's very nerve-wracking for the Democratic leadership. It's also nerve-wracking for a Democratic governor to steamroll through a tax increase where there's not one bipartisan vote for it, because then it gets used against people in the subsequent election. And I say that from experience. When Ed Rendell, with the only tax increase we've had in 25 years, when Ed Rendell was governor, we were able to get some, very few, but some Republican votes for that. And what Ed Rendell promised to those Republicans who voted for that tax increase was we would not support candidates running against the R's who put up that vote to use that vote against the Democrats, to use that against them, because that was a vote for the schools. That would, Ed Rendell put $2.7 billion into the schools, made possible by the tax increase and by the legalization of the gaming. And so it's really important to understand progressive candidates are what's going to make it possible for us to fund the schools, but it is not only progressive candidates at the end of the day that will make it possible for us to get that over the finish line in a way that saves their seats and makes them re-electable. Now, I will say there is nobody in the 2003 tax vote who lost their seat. So I want to remind people that voting for taxes is not the danger that we have had drilled in our head, but it is one that we have to navigate smartly and wisely. And one of the ways that the Rendell tax increase succeeded is it was for schools specifically. It was very clear how it was going to be used. There were 9 eligible uses for the funds. So reducing class size, expanding pre-K, increasing multilingual education, increasing science education, technical education, very specific ways that school districts and taxpayers knew this is what these resources could be used for. It had the support, a broad coalition of support, and that's what these things take, and being smart about how we talk about it. So I gave you a lot of data points, but I will tell you at the end of the day, what voters want is reasonable taxes, small class size, quality schools they can depend on, and lawmakers who will champion what kids needs. And it's teachers, it's librarians, it's school nurses, it's quality schools. And if you can speak to those issues and then come in and fight on the details, you'll win and the kids will win. And I just want to say, I wore this purposely. This is the PA Schools Work Campaign. And so this is the statewide campaign that is speaking to the issues that I raised with you today. It's a broad coalition. Get to know us and we'll get to know you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Donna. And I think you raised some great points both for our candidates, but we're going to switch right now to our current state senator, Lindsey Williams. She, as I mentioned, she is on the Senate Education Committee. Lindsey's also the only woman on the Democrat on the state. Are you the only woman or the only woman?
I'm a woman, full stop.
Full stop. The only woman on the state education committee for the Senate. And Lindsey, how much do you know, Donna raised a lot of issues that are going to should be being discussed and debated in both the House and the Senate in terms of education. How much do you talk about these things, and what will be your first little bit, and how are you going to talk about them after you're in the majority? I know it's going to be a bipartisan discussion, but.
Absolutely. I mean, what has happened since I've been there is we've talked around the edges, and you know, I could wonk out on education for a very long time. Donna and I should just go and sit in a room somewhere and we'd have a blast. But we're kind of doing around the edges. We're not having the serious conversations about what we really need to do to address not only our K-12, our pre-K, our childcare space, and higher education. You know, our education system needs intensive investment and reimagining how we do it from the beginning to the end. And we've done little things like, you know, within the budget, we flat funded schools. So that's great. We didn't cut them, but our schools are facing increased costs. You know, there is inflation. So what is flat funding is actually technically a cut for these schools. And they're having all these costs for COVID in terms of cleaning and busing and everything. But also, our kids are going to need a lot of support when they get back to catch them up. And we aren't doing or talking about any of that and how we're gonna pay for it. We were able, Senator Judy Schwenk and I had a piece of legislation that proposed using the federal dollars for both childcare and pre-K and Head Start. We got the bulk of what we asked for childcare, but we proposed $17 million for pre-K and Head Start expansion and $50 million to extend pre-K and Head Start into the summer. We got $9 million for pre-K and Head Start.
Say that again.
We got $9 million
out of
we proposed $67 million. So they did just a little bit. So you can say, oh, we did something for pre-K, but we don't have nowhere near what we need in terms of funding for pre-K. And that is the most bang for our buck, our investment. I'm sure Michele Knoll is going to talk about that. That's her space. But, you know, also in the budget, you know, negotiations, you know, myself and Senator Brewster had a charter school reform package that would have saved school districts $300 million in just, you know, redoing how charter schools send money for special education students and how they fund cyber charters. The two biggest pieces where the money is the most absurd in how we spend it. And I proposed that amendment, and the Republicans said, well, if you run your amendment, we're going to run the bill that puts vouchers in city school districts. And so I said, okay, I don't want vouchers in Pennsylvania. EITC is bad enough because that's a backdoor voucher. And I pulled my amendment. We didn't have the entire budget negotiations were not even reforming how we fund charter schools was not even on the menu. So that's where changing who's in the majority changes what we're talking about, because we're no longer, you know, talking on the edges and getting just a little tiny piece to say, oh, we did something about education so they can run on it. We can actually do what needs to be done to move from the most inequitably funded education system in the country to something hopefully way better than that. Like, I want to get to a point where we are equitably funding all of our schools. We are back to spending 50% on our schools in terms of K through 12, but that we are investing in from beginning to end. So we in the minority, we don't control the agenda. We don't control what bills run. We don't control, if there's a hearing, we don't control who testifies. So for instance, when we were talking about, you know, some of these bills, the American Federation of Teachers that represents Philadelphia schools, Pittsburgh city schools, Scranton city schools, and many other teachers across the Commonwealth they weren't even at the table. So you have the two largest school systems in our Commonwealth not involved in the negotiations in terms of teacher evaluations, charter schools, school budget. You know, PCCY was represented, which is great, but you also need to represent the urban centers as well. Like, you can't just represent a piece of our education system. So there are things like that where even just who we're hearing from in an education hearing is not well-rounded. So flipping seats is critical to having a full conversation, to moving the bills we want to move, and then getting them to the governor's desk for signature. So the work that Represent does is vital in that. Represent, you know, supported me. I Represent supported a lot of other women, and we have a lot of work to do. So thank you all for being on this call and helping and learning, and thanks for letting me geek out in the morning on education a little bit.
You know, you were going to be my favorite education geek from the legislature. So thank you for being with us. And I think, you know, listen to what Donna said about we needed to make sure that we fund better all the money that's gone out of the system. And then hear what Senator Williams had to say about the fact that this is so unequal and we can't even have discussions about it. So yes, I fully buy into the, you know, me personally, I buy into the, we need to be bipartisan, we need to give everybody something to run on, but you have to allow witnesses on both sides. You have to allow free discussion. You have to let people talk about it. And oh, by the way, the pie has to be bigger. And I think these are all going to be critical things to be talking about. So now I want to bring on Michele Knoll, who's running in Allegheny County for House District 44. Michele, in a few minutes, you're going to tell us why, you know, you've been in the education world for a while. Why did you feel it was necessary to run for legislature to bring change? Why was that not, why couldn't you do everything from your school board kind of roles?
I'm not on the school board right now. I was actually when we were funding schools at 50%. So I took a lot of notes from Donna and as well as from Lindsey. I really feel that there is, as an educator, I'm an early interventionist. So I get into daycares, I get into homes, and I have a lot of, I have a great perspective on what families are really dealing with and what they can afford or not afford. But I also see from the early education side, the needs that we have, and also from the special education. When I was a classroom teacher, I didn't deal as much with special education as now it's my field. I talked to a variety of people before I came on this call, you know, a high school teacher, a school board president, an agency, an early intervention agency, a professor, because it is a whole problem. It's not just, you know, you can't separate out the pieces as easily as we'd like to think. And the biggest thing that they are worried about is the educational cuts that they think will be coming this year, because education is easy to cut. And looking at the costs of what is going to happen with the pandemic and how schools are going to manage it. I listened in on a education committee last week or 2 weeks ago, and heard from Philadelphia School, Allentown, Catholic schools, you know, someone here, Hillel Academy in Pittsburgh, a couple other private schools, charter schools. And it was very interesting to hear the differences in the kind of concerns they have, and to kind of put that all together in a package that really adds up to nobody is getting a fair piece of the pie. The charters, you know, are a huge issue for me. I have to say that I went on door, I hear a lot about property tax in Allegheny County. And I live in a very affluent district with about a 97% high school graduation rate. So when I'm hearing about it, I'm hearing about it from people who are in very, very excellent school districts. But I feel that if we enacted a severance fee, we close the Delaware loophole, which the governor is working on, and that we hold charters and cybers accountable. A lot of people don't understand how that whole that cybers are really not a brick and mortar. From a special ed perspective, I understand what Donna was speaking about in terms of what charters are getting that they should not get. The very districts who are crippled by charter schools don't have the kind of money to go after students who start the year at the charter. The money never comes back, you know, and so there's a lot there that needs to be going on so that we can track the money and stop the bleeding from some of the school districts, even if you don't have in the Pittsburgh area a charter in your district. For instance, Clairton, which is nowhere near me, they have 13 charters surrounding that district, so it's killing them. We also have these unfunded mandates from the federal government, the special ed, and just like Donna said, you're having to take money from regular ed to pay for that special ed because it's the law. You must do those things with children in special ed. This year, we really observed the technology gap, you know, because the haves and the have-nots, kids, my school district and the local school districts made a lot of accommodations. Parents can afford to have several technological devices that kids can connect with their schools. We have good connectivity. The middle of the state doesn't have good connectivity. Really outside of Allegheny County, you get into that. So you see this gap, not only the academic slide that we have in the summer, but you had this enormous technology gap this year. Some schools not getting work to their kids for months after the schools were closed down. I talked a little bit to people about reducing testing in the state. I was in an education committee some time ago, a couple years ago, and they were talking about the Keystone tests. And I know as a school board member, I know how much they cost. I know as a teacher how much time lost in instruction you have. We test kids an awful lot, and we spend an awful lot of money on that. And when I was at this particular hearing, I noticed that no one else in the room was an educator, probably except for me. So they've never given a standardized test. They've never scored one. They've never interpreted the results and designed instruction or remediation from that. And so we have a whole lot of people in Harrisburg who have never dealt with issues on a day-to-day basis as an educator. And that's one of the reasons I want to go to Harrisburg, because I have lived those things. I've also taught in a school district that had a lot of inequities, and forgive me, Lindsay, it's the city schools, but I taught in the Hill District, and I couldn't get orange crayons the whole year I taught first grade. And then I later found out that there's a school with a swimming pool in that same district. That inequity exists in that same school district. So you have all those things that, and Donna referred to this too, even schools, even wealthy schools, that happens. You know, everybody knows that this is the elementary school you want to be at when you're in the North Hills School District, or if you're in this school in Quaker Valley, that's the better school to be in. So those kind of things are very worrisome to me as a teacher. All the schools are very worried. I was in this recent education thing about returning. How are we going to deal with all this stuff? We don't have nurses. We don't enough nurses. We don't have enough supplies. How are we going to split our time? The very big Philadelphia was represented. How are you going to do an A week and a B week, or an A start and a B start? You don't have enough buses. You don't have enough bus drivers. You have to put so many buses on the charters, so many buses on the Catholic schools. So, and sadly, they aren't getting a lot of help from the Department of Ed, because the Department of Ed is saying, figure it out yourself. Yes. And so they're kind of all trying to figure it out on their own and using whatever little pieces they get from other districts. I heard that from a history teacher at one school district, a school board president, we're using this or that. So
that's great. I think we got to move on, Michelle, but thank you very much. And again, what Michelle's point is two things. First of all, inequity. Someday I want to know why orange crayons were a problem and not other color crayons. I just am curious. But also, it's not only inequity, but again, going back to the both Senator Williams and Donna Cooper, the pie is not big enough. But the good thing is Michelle proposed a couple different ways that the pie can grow without going after everybody's property tax. And I want to bring up Emily Skopov now. Emily is also running for, right now she's she ran a wonderful race last cycle. Both Michelle and both Michelle and Emily are returning represent people. They both ran valiant efforts last cycle and didn't make it, and this time it's going to be different. Emily surprised everybody last cycle by coming as close as she did to Mike Turzai, who was the speaker. He's now resigned, and so it's an open seat. But Emily, tell us about you and education in 5 minutes.
All right, in 5 minutes, here we go. First, I want to thank everybody for having me be here this morning, and also I have to give a shout out to Senator Lindsey Williams. I am one of her constituents, and also whenever constituents call me because they never got a response from Mike Turzai, I send them to Lindsey Williams' office. She has set an example for constituent services. Like I mean, really, she has been inspiring in terms of what she's done getting in office. So she was always my response when people say, what can you do as a new legislator? You have no power. And I say, look at Lindsey Williams. And they usually, I mean, truly, she has been my best defense to that question. I mean, she shows people how to get it done, and it's really remarkable and inspirational. So education, I come from a family of educators, mother, mother, aunt, grandmother, mother-in-law, all the way up through, principals, vice principals, but almost entirely in urban schools and schools with children at low incomes. So I've seen what it takes. I've seen what it means. I'm a public school kid in a very blue collar working class area in New York. So I understand how important a public education is and also what it can be. In this district, what I think has been, I don't want to always say the challenge, we have excellent public schools. They are some of the best. I think we are one of the most highly educated districts in all of Allegheny County. A huge percentage, I believe it's like 35%, have a graduate degree or higher. So it's very educated, and to make the case, and until recently we were predominantly Republican, and as most folks know, when I ran last time, my whole goal was to say this district is not what everyone is telling me it is, the perception of this district. So, I like to say what I learned to do knocking doors was to speak Republican. For the 2 years that I ran, the last time I spent 20 months out of 24 months of campaigning only going to Republican households. And what I found is the most important thing, it's really how can you convince people that what is doing the right thing is also good for them financially. And so for me, education is moral, it's ethical. I believe every kid, that is a human right. I think that's the most basic right besides healthcare that we can really bestow on our children, that every child in Pennsylvania should be really educated with the same amount of, equity and opportunity, and making sure every kid has what they need to succeed. But what I found is people in this district will say, well, I feel you, but we have great schools here, sort of, and again, they want to talk about property taxes, as Michele Knoll said. So a couple things, I found it's been a process of education. It's like, do you understand that our state, you have to hit them with stats. The state doesn't really give us the money. That's why your property taxes are going up. But more importantly, to make the case that educating children across the state is a good investment for them. So getting them to understand that economically and fiscally, we have taken such a short-term view on education that, it looks like a good win when we say we're cutting, we're saving money, but in the long term, you're stranding children without the ability to become really contributing members of society, to be self-sustaining. Anytime you don't have educated people, crime goes up, drug use goes up, depression, anxiety, all of these issues happen. And so we're not actually equipping people to be better citizens of the Commonwealth. And while, again, that's not how I feel ethically or morally per se, that is what really works in a district like this, when you can try to get people to understand the long term of why this disparity between our wealthiest and poor districts, and that is a staggering number. I mean, that's horrifying to people here. Talking about college debt, that's horrifying. When they understand where we rank compared to other states, and they start to understand how we got there, it's all about, unfortunately, the bottom line for them. And so when I say, your kids are being well educated in North Allegheny, but what about those kids down the road who are not being well educated? Your child will be taking care of that child one day. That child will be a drain on social services because we did not equip that child to grow up and take care of themselves, to take care of their families, to have a well-paying job. And that's what I found has been a really persuasive argument when people really when they think about the economics of, I always say education is the best investment we can possibly make. And that is really, and you see every possible, positive outcome from investing. Most people here don't know about the EITC, which I think is, horrific. That's been another point that really, that means a lot to the people in this district when you explain that they are not fans of charters, especially because we have these wonderful public schools. They do not like the idea of private money, really, or public money rather, going into essentially private education, religious education, some of these other things. They're not fans of the cyber charter options. So for them, I've really found talking to them in a way that is really clear about the finances of it. I mean, for the Democrats here, I don't have to sell most of them on anything. There are a lot more Democrats in this area than used to be. There are a lot more progressives than one would think. And even the independents seem to understand it. But when you talk to the Republicans and say, you're not personally experiencing it now, but in a way that you are. We could be a much better state economically and in every other way. And also we lose out business when people don't want to move to a state that doesn't take care of education, when college debt is going up, when we have, as you said, a poor community college system. We are not a good sell to people who want to move here. Why would they want to come when you look at some of these stats? So when I put it in that kind of a package, that it's better for the overall health of the Commonwealth to invest in education, that's really, to me, has been the most effective.
I think that's great. And thank you very much, Emily. We'll continue to support you, and we hope that you're elected and the district won't have to keep going to Lindsey when they have questions. They'll have somebody who worries about constituent services.
I would love to have a partner.
Yes,
yeah,
that's it. That's it. And I have just one of the questions. We have some great questions, and we'll send out answers when we thank you all for coming today. But a quick question for both Donna and Lindsey. If you could, and this is why this is a quick question. If you could give me the 1 minute elevator speech or 1.5 minute elevator speech that you personally wish all the candidates were using on education, you know, because as Emily just mentioned, people are afraid, you know, and Michele has mentioned, people are afraid their taxes are going to go up. They like their schools, so why should they worry about anybody else? Pick whatever piece of that you want. But we've got some other candidates on this call. What's the hit them in the face comment that you want them to make? In a nicer way than hitting them in the face, of course.
Go ahead, Donna. You can go first.
Definitely hitting them in the face is a bad idea, but let's try this.
I'm sorry, you know.
That's okay. So I think, you know, sort of Emily and Lindsey really hit the nail on the head, and it goes back to Michele a little bit. Look, your taxes are going up because Pennsylvania is an embarrassment. It is one of the few states that is failing to meet its obligation to fund the schools. If you want good schools, if you want lower property taxes in the future, then you've got to support me, because I'm going to go there and make sure the state steps to the plate and puts its money on the table instead of yours.
Yep.
Thank you.
I would agree. You know, if you know that most of the Democrats are going to be on board with you, those persuadables that you need, it is your opponent. I know Michele's opponent, Emily's opponent, Lissa Geiger-Schulman's opponent out in my side of the state. They all voted to expand EITC to $100 million with an automatic escalator. That investment of EITC is raising your tax dollars. You pay tax dollars, you're going to pay more with an increase to EITC. So that's too long. But basically, the votes they have taken mean your local property taxes have gone up. If you want your local property taxes to stay the same or go down, you need to invest in public schools on the state level and not vote to privatize our education, because you're funding two unequal systems.
Thank you.
And it works. It works. It absolutely works on the doors. It works messaging, and, you know, especially, and when you talk about pre-K and childcare as well, those are, the rest of our Commonwealth cannot go to work without high quality pre-K and childcare to send their kids to. So that is also an investment where people know they can't find affordable quality childcare or pre-K, and they need that to go to work. That's another piece that's important.
Christine, may I say one other thing? I would say everywhere you go in the state, people are seeing rising class sizes. And they are seeing reduction in enrichment services, whether it's sports teams where it's pay to play, fewer school nurses, fewer school counselors. Just talk about regular stuff that people care about.
Thank you. I think, you know, one of the speakers we had recently, Shanna Danielson, who recently won a primary. She's running, I think, Cumberland County.
She's amazing. She's amazing.
Well, one of the things that she talks about is this isn't an East versus West problem. This isn't an urban versus not urban problem. This is a statewide problem. And the time that she was talking about the fact that she was teaching keyboarding in schools using keyboards that were not connected to computers because they didn't have enough computers for everybody to be able to log in and see what they were typing. Can you imagine? That's the kind of problem we have in this Commonwealth, and that's why we need to do the work that we're doing. So,
and you know, the kids see it too. I'm sorry, Christine. The kids, when you talk to students, they know the difference and they are suffering under it.
Right. That's right. And so I want to just give, you know, of course, I've run over time again because because I always invite too many fabulous women that I can't not have them speak. Just 30 seconds then from some of the other candidates we have on the call. Helen, if you want to bring them up. I know Claudette Williams, are you still on the call?
I'm still here.
Okay, Claudette, 30 seconds. Is education important in Monroe County? You're muted.
In Monroe County, education is very, very important, and we're speaking the same language as the candidates on the call and Donna has stated. So yes, very, very much so in Monroe County.
Thank you. And we appreciate your being on here. Lauren LaRue, you're in Bucks County. What's going on in education in Bucks?
Hi, there I am, sorry. Yeah, education is important here because people are mostly concerned about property taxes. So I tie it back to the state funding of education. I say, since the state's been cutting funding at the, in Harrisburg, the districts have to raise the taxes. And in fact, our school district has raised taxes for the last 3 years in a row. In the last 2 years, it was the max that they could raise. And this year, they didn't seek the max that they could raise it, but they raised it by almost 2%. And people are livid about it. So I remind people that it's because of a lack of education funding, and that usually gets them on board.
Thank you very much.
Hi. I'm running in the 138th district in Northampton County. That's the Lehigh Valley. I know that education is very important because I am an educator myself. I am an adjunct professor at Northampton County Community College, and I have kids in grade school and in college. So I know how hard it is and what parents have had to go through with trying to teach their kids at home and how the districts have suffered. I talked to a lot of people around here about education, and my opponent wants to actually eliminate property tax, but has absolutely no plan to fund education. So she's promising people to eliminate their property taxes with no solution for education. And education is one of my core initiatives that I'm trying to push. And so it's very important. This was a great conversation. Thank you so much, Represent PA.
Thank you. Lindsey Drew, how are you doing? What's going on in education?
Good morning. Thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Education is incredibly important in my district, and it's incredibly important for me. I'm a school board director in Derry Township, and I've served as vice president and treasurer of our school board, and I've seen firsthand the difference that representation by Democratic women can make in education. In the last 3 years, we have turned our school board to be a female Democratic majority, with all 3 of our officers now being Democratic women. And as a result, we've been able to really address inequities. We're one of the only school districts that have adopted and passed policies for diversity, inclusion, and equity, and transgender and gender non-conforming policies. We've been able to direct funds within our budget to address social emotional needs. And so I've kind of hit a wall in realizing that the more that we were doing for our students in our district, the greater the disparities were becoming in my eyes to the districts around us. And so I want to bring that model and that idea to Harrisburg to be able to represent the 106th district, but also for all students, because I believe that if we are setting ourselves up for a crisis in the future if we don't begin to address the inequities and make education available and equal regardless of the zip code that a student lives in. You know, as Pennsylvanians, that's what they deserve, and it's for our future. And as a mom, that's really important to me. So I'm looking forward to it. I appreciate the support of Represent. It has been just a huge boost here, especially in my district, because I'm running against a Labor Republican, and everything, you know, is a little bit harder, you know, from a funding. So Represent has made a huge difference, and I can't wait to get across that finish line in November. So I appreciate all of you.
Thank you very much. And finally, Michelle Worley.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much for holding this forum this morning. This has been so informative. I've taken so many notes. A lot of things have already been said, so I certainly don't want to repeat. But what I will say is Emily's experience and her comments really resonated with me. I'm running in the 41st State House District, which is portions of Lancaster County. And I too talk to a lot of Republicans. I spend the primary focus of my time when I ran for this seat in 2018 and again now, talking to Republicans and trying to do persuasion and trying to convince them that educating students across the state is good for everyone is a challenge. We run into those same things because they do want to try in this area to make it an urban problem. And It is not an urban problem. Some of the lowest funded districts are here in Lancaster County. We have that issue here. And I worked in higher education for years, so I come at this from being a part of the public school system. I grew up in a working class, blue collar family. I'm a product of the public schools, so is my husband, so is our son. We have to have a strong public education system in this state, and I don't care where students live, I don't care what their zip code is, they deserve a quality education and a safe education and a safe environment. And we're not providing that in so many ways. So I look at it from the public school perspective, but I look at it from the higher ed perspective as well, because I worked in a for-profit institute for about 3 years and then 11 years in community college at Harrisburg Area Community College, and now I'm in business. And I have a very clear understanding that quality education at all levels is a driver of workforce and economic development. And if Pennsylvania doesn't correct all of these challenges, if we don't reform K through 12, if we don't do something about pre-K, and if we're not looking at the challenges in higher ed, we're going to continue to fall behind in a variety of areas, and it's going to affect us economically. It's going to affect us in social ways. There are numerous areas where we're going to fall behind, and we've got to do better. We just have to.
And I want to sum up this conversation with is, we all believe in education. We all believe that this is a statewide issue. I love the fact that our candidates and our elected people are talking about the fact they want to be strong for their own districts, but they want their districts to understand it's a statewide issue. Part of the reason I wanted to talk about education is we view a lot of these things to be part of the movement. We've been asked what we're doing, you know, a lot of the stuff, a lot of information going on right now in terms of Black Lives Matter and the racial discussions we're having. This is a racial equity issue also. We want to make sure that all Pennsylvanians, regardless of where they live, regardless of what they look like, regardless of anything, have an equal opportunity in this Commonwealth. And this is, education is really one way that we all can work on this together. What can you do for us? We want you to invest money with us. Have I mentioned the fact that we raise money and you heard these wonderful candidates, we want to give them more. Host a fundraiser, find a group of friends who want to learn more. We'll find one candidate to come and talk to them and talk about whatever issue you'd like. We've got some really good ones coming up that people have put together for their friend groups. And as I mentioned, we're also doing these breakfast briefings as a way to make sure people know what's going on in the Commonwealth. July 16th is our next one. It's going to be on policing and some of the issues that have been raised in the state. Joanna McClinton, who is the head of the Democratic caucus in the House, is also, and she's a state rep from the Philadelphia area. She's going to talk about some of the policing proposals and what they look like and why we need to have people paying attention to these things in Harrisburg. July 30th, I think, 31st, the date will be coming. We have July 31st, we're going to talk about fracking, and Katie Bloom from Conservation PA is going to be our lead speaker on that one. And we'll have some other candidates talk then, but also we're going to talk about, you know, fracking, jobs, what's going on. We want to give you some education so that you all can talk about it. You all can, when people are discussing these things, you're all up to date on the big issues in Pennsylvania. And thank you. You know, again, we raise money, donate today, but also we want to help you educate your friends. If you thought this was interesting, tell your friends to go look in the next week or two. We should have the video up on our website. And thank you to our candidates and to our speakers today. I learned a lot and I thought I was up to date on all these things. So your passion, your interest, and your goals of changing Pennsylvania are certainly impressive. Thank you.